Now, we have laws that prevent speech that incites violence, racial hatred, or discrimination against sexual practice. My next guest doesn't necessarily think they're a good thing. And when you hear the story, you might understand why. First of all, just think about the whole idea of someone else determining what you are allowed to say and how you're allowed to say it, and more. The ultimate tyranny of the mind, if you like. Topher Field has made a short film called The Forbidden History of Unpopular People. Now, Topher Field's been around for a while. He's actually quite a good short filmmaker, based down south. He once made a very good short film about water and public water in Victoria, and we know that water's a big political issue in Australia, but getting more so. He also made one on Qantas Airlines recently. Topher Field has kindly agreed to join me this morning. Topher, thanks for coming to the studios down there. I appreciate it.
G'day, Steve. Thanks for having me. And just for the record, it's Topher Field, as in the second half of Christopher.
And well, that was my first question. We were working out, so this guy's name's got to be Christopher. So
that's right.
My dad was
Christopher, and my dad was Christopher, and I'm Christopher, and so we made a deal. My dad got the first half of the name, I got the second half of the name, and that was that. We had a truce on those lines.
Well, it sort of took off in the office here amongst my production team. We tried to call each other the second half of our first name. So my name's Fen for the purposes of this interview.
Oh yes, okay, Fen. Good to talk to you.
Yes. Now, so first of all, give me your views as a filmmaker on freedom of speech. And I mean, you really think that something's going on here. But just paint, first of all, how important speech is to us historically.
Well, historically speaking, it's got to be one of the most important rights that we have. If we don't actually have the right to speak our mind, to say what we think, then what rights do we really have at all? Restrictions of speech immediately translate into restrictions on thought. If we're not allowed to speak our mind, then are we really free to think for ourselves, to share ideas, to come to our own conclusions? The answer has to be no. Historically
so for your point, restrictions, any sort of restriction on speech is a restriction on thought and that verbal expression of thought.
By default, yes. It cannot be any other way. Now, historically speaking, it's been those who have disagreed with the orthodox opinions of the time that have actually driven our progress forward. It's been those who have dissented from the popular view, be it throughout history when it comes to the obvious and popular examples such as your flat earth or washing your hands, germ theory, those sorts of issues. All of the things that we take for granted as being absolutely true today started out as a crackpot theory. They started out as some fringe dweller saying some crazy thing that at the time, often in a lot of cases, they couldn't even prove what they were saying to begin with, and yet today we take it completely for granted. So my concern as we move, I believe, very quickly towards a society where we're not allowed to dissent from the popular opinion, we're not allowed to disagree with the established wisdom, if you like, that we're actually stifling the very people who could potentially hold the key to yet another step of progress along the way.
Now, I'm fascinated by speech and language, partly because I'm a radio announcer, but because every now and then in this job you come across people who've been, had sanctions brought against them for making unpopular statements. Right. Sometimes they're wrong, sometimes they're right. That's not the point in your mind.
That's absolutely true. The point is, for me, that we each ought to be able to use our own mind to come to our own conclusions and to use whatever means are available to us to state those conclusions for everyone else to hear and come to their own conclusions. I don't believe that we ought to allow one human being, no matter how well educated, no matter how well intentioned, we should not be allowing one human being to dictate to another human being what they may and may not think and what they may and may not say.
The best example I think you use in your short film is the doctor who went against medical convention.
That's right.
Went against medical convention before germs were even known about. Tell the story, if you would, please, Topher.
Well, his name was Ignaz Semmelweis, and anyone who's done biology will be very, very familiar with that name. Now, he was a man who worked with childbirth, with mothers giving birth and so forth, and at the time in his part of Europe, the death rates were absolutely appalling, sometimes reaching up towards the 30% rate. And I'm not talking about the babies, I'm talking about the mothers. Mothers would get infections. It was referred to as childbed fever, and at the time, of course, disease was not well understood, and so the causes were not well understood. What Ignaz noticed was that what he came to believe for various reasons was that these infections or these diseases, this illness, was being caused by the very doctors who were helping them give birth. The doctors were cutting up bodies in autopsies, and often these were the bodies of the mothers who had just recently died in the ward. They were cutting up those bodies and doing autopsies and trying to understand what had happened to them, and then they would walk immediately into a mother who was in labour and help her give birth without washing their hands in between. Now, of course, today that makes our skin crawl. The very thought of doing that is just ridiculous. Why would they think that? Well, of course, back then they had no understanding of germ theory. They were still very much operating on a 2,000-year-old theory of the humours of the body and the idea of bleeding and causing someone to give blood and so forth to try and bring balance to the humours of the body. What we regard today as absolute quackery, but at the time it was cutting-edge science, and people were paid an absolute fortune by kings to take blood out of them, as ridiculous as that sounds today. And so along comes this doctor who could not give any scientific justification. There was no understanding of germs, microbiology, none of that was understood. But he came along and he said, guys, I believe there is a link between us doing autopsies and then going in without having washed our hands and helping these mothers give birth. And
so
I
he simply
that's why they
observed
died.
something.
Correct.
He told people about it. He couldn't explain the science, but he observed
Correct.
it, and the facts on face value were correct.
And
the death rates plummet when you wash your hands.
That's correct. He introduced a hand-washing regime at the hospital where he was working, and the death rates plummeted down to below 2% from occasionally as high as 30%. So the results were in, but he didn't necessarily have the ability to explain the why of why it worked. Now, you've got to understand, this guy was absolutely pilloried. He was not necessarily a polite guy. He was considered to be very strong-headed and abrasive and so forth. So he was
abrasive, obnoxious, in your face.
That's right. He didn't have charm working in his favour, but he did have results working in his favour, and yet those results were ignored because he was going against the orthodoxy of the time. He ultimately died in an insane asylum. He was tricked into going into an insane asylum to look at a patient, and then they locked him in. And it's understood, although there's a little bit of mystery surrounding this, it's understood that he was beaten by the guards and that he died of an infection very similar to the very ones that he was trying to prevent in mothers giving birth.
A cruel twist of fate.
Yeah, it is. And to die at such a young age as potentially one of the medical geniuses of our time, whose observations were simply not tolerated because they cut across the conventional wisdom.
So he went against the known medical orthodoxy at the time, the collective scientific wisdom at the time. He went against it. He couldn't necessarily explain it, but he could observe it. But he was pilloried and lampooned. And eventually sort of shut down, as it were.
Yeah, and ultimately, I wouldn't say that he was murdered, but he certainly met an early end because of the opposition that he received.
Now, give me some other examples of unpopular people who were sort of shouted down. In my mind, when you have laws, and we have some of those laws in Australia today.
We certainly do.
In a range of areas that we'll come to in a moment. But the problem with the media today, in my mind, is that people like me, we get people in the radio studio and the TV studio who are articulate, attractive, smooth in their delivery, professional, and on the face they seem credible. And quite often they're completely and utterly wrong. But they've got good media machines. They've got good spin machines.
Exactly.
And so give me an example of some others from history that have been unpopular but who've been right.
Well, there are many, and the overused example of Galileo. Once again, he looked up into the heavens. He observed things that he believed were inconsistent with the cosmology that was being used at the time. He developed his own cosmology, and once again couldn't really prove it. And the reason I don't use Galileo as a prime example in the short film that I've made is because there is so much controversy surrounding him, and there are people who argue that he was one type of person, and people who argue that he was another. There are people who argue that actually the rulers of the day were perfectly tolerant of his view of the world, but they were not tolerant of the fact that he viewed it as the only way to view the universe, rather than accepting it as one possibility among many. So there was just too much controversy surrounding who he really was and what he really said and did for me to use him as a prime example. But I do believe that he's an example of someone who was actually correct, and yet once again, because of his own personal failings and a possibly abrasive personality and so on and so forth, he fell foul of the authorities of the day. And therefore did not get the sort of success and the recognition that he deserved within his own lifetime. You can fast forward if you want some more modern and perhaps more political examples. You could argue that someone like a Martin Luther King fits the bill very nicely. Once again, there's a lot of controversy now about who he really was, what his real agenda was, and so forth. But he was standing up against an orthodoxy that said that black people were actually inferior as human beings to white people. which is an orthodoxy that I find very offensive. But at the time, there were people who found him denying that orthodoxy to be very offensive.
Yes, I mean, he was a very
flawed.
flawed.
To shut him down.
Yes, I mean, we now know he was a very flawed character in his
Absolutely.
private life, but the point is we all are.
Well, yes, absolutely. I'm not going to put my hand up and try and pretend I'm perfect.
Yes.
And yet here he was one of the few people at the time who had the guts to really lead a movement against an orthodoxy, an entrenched understanding of the world that we almost universally, not quite universally, but almost universally recognise today was absolutely wrong. The orthodoxy at the time was wrong, and he was one of the few who were willing to stand against that.
Now, you're a filmmaker that also uses the online world to tell your film, to tell your stories and show your short films. While we've been talking, a listener has sent me a tweet saying, look, I disagree essentially with the premise. Social media has made free speech and publishing to a mass audience not only easier but more accessible. What do you think about that?
I actually agree with what that listener has said. However, that's not the entire picture. What's happening at the moment with for example, the Finkelstein report, which is really the main subject in terms of what I'm criticising in my short film, is the Finkelstein report. What the recommendation that has been made...
Let me just explain what this is. The federal government has had 2 media inquiries underway in Australia, one looking at convergence and the Finkelstein report looking at what's called legacy media. In particular, many believe as a direct response to News Limited's attack on the federal government. And many see this as sort of a political response by the federal government, which the feds are planning a public interest test, a fit and proper person test, and, well, that's already there, but a whole lot of intrusions into the fourth estate, as the media used to be known.
The only thing I disagree with what you just said there was that the Finkelstein report was into the legacy media. That may be how it's being portrayed, but that's certainly not true. Any website that, off the top of my head, I believe gets more than 15,000 hits per year, which amounts to only around about 42 per day.
Yes, that's
not
right.
A busy website.
Yep, you're right.
Potentially falls under the purview of this particular new body. My own videos would potentially fall under the purview of this particular body, even though I don't fit any of their descriptions of what a media network is. I mean, I am a single operator with my own video camera, generally self-funded, although this most recent video on free speech, I did get a lot of support from my own fans and so forth. I don't fit any of the, I don't have any of the agendas or any of the money or any of the influence that the Finkelstein report is supposed to be reining in and bringing under control, and yet, under the terms that they've set out in the Finkelstein report, I will be captured and I will be held potentially liable under this council that is being sold to us as protecting us against the legacy media. So what's happening with this Finkelstein report is we're moving away from holding accountable professional journalists, and they're trying to get power over absolutely everyone who says anything that anyone listens to. We need to look at we need to take it through to its logical conclusion in order to really see where this goes. Firstly, we need to understand that restricting what people can say does not actually achieve anything. If, for example, I were to write a law that said you were never allowed ever on radio to tell people that the world is flat, is that going to change your view about whether or not the world is flat? Is that going to change the view of any of your listeners about whether or not the world is flat?
It'll probably, judging from history, it'll probably make it slightly worse.
If history is anything to go by, certainly. And so we first of all see that restricting speech is often ineffective in changing attitudes. So if we're concerned about the attitudes that people hold, restricting speech is not an effective way to deal with that. Secondly, if we actually take them to their logical conclusion, if we take these restrictions and say, okay, the council has stepped in and said, okay, Mr. Whomever, you are not allowed to say X, Y, or Z. What do the council do, and what do we as a society do if that person ignores what the council has told them to do? If that person continues to say that thing, how far are we as a society willing to take it? Are we willing to throw that person in jail in the end? Are we willing to actually admit to ourselves that by introducing a council that has the power to decide for us what we are and are not allowed to say, must in the end also have the power to throw us in jail, to bankrupt us, to fine us, to impose penalties if we do not comply? The two go hand in hand. You cannot say that we're going to have a council that has this power and deny that we are then putting ourselves into a position of all the great tyrannies of history where we will actually punish people for what they say. We should, at this point in time, be entering a new era, if you like, of free speech, where each of us with limited technology, the sort of technology that most of us do already have in our own home, are able to put our own thoughts out into the public space and be able to share what we're thinking and our opinion on any sort of a subject in a way that wasn't possible when you had to, for example, be able to write a letter to the editor and have that published, or these various other slower methods that were available to people, up until, say, 20 years ago. So we should be entering a really new era of free speech, but we're not, because concurrent with this rise in the access that each of us has to platforms, the ability to speak and the ability to be heard, concurrent with that is a real bureaucratic net that's being thrown over that to try and constrain it, to try and control it, to try and make sure that we never really get the ability to say what we really actually think.
Can you list for me some of the regulations that exist in Australia that restrict freedom of speech, Topher? I should have asked you this earlier on.
Well, most of my research has focused on where we're heading in terms of the Finkelstein report and the various proposals that have been put in front of us. But I can tell you already that we've had some prosecutions down in Victoria because of controversial journalists or controversial, for example, religious leaders who have offended the sensibilities of other people and been sued under racial and religious vilification laws or similar sorts of things, where all of a sudden we're no longer allowed to have a debate about a particular religion or a particular gender identity or sexuality or a particular way of viewing the world. We're no longer actually able to have a debate about the merits or the pros and cons or about what they actually stand for. All of a sudden, we're all required by political correctness to keep our mouths shut if we disagree with them, although those who tend to be within these protected minorities can say whatever they like.
I think you're talking about Pastor Daniel Scott, whom I've interviewed, lives here in Queensland, someone who escaped life-threatening events in Pakistan, came to Australia only to find himself nearly bankrupted because he said something that some Islamists in Victoria were unhappy with.
That's right. And he was with another Danny, actually, a Pastor Daniel Nalaya down here in Victoria. And my understanding is, correct me if I'm wrong, that they were both prosecuted for what was said at this particular meeting. Now, the particulars are very interesting, and I don't really want to go into them in too much depth, except to say someone like Pastor Daniel Scott, I think, is qualified to speak about a religion that was such a significant part of his life for so many years. And
Yes.
Yet his opinion is not allowed because it contradicts the orthodoxy. It contradicts what we today refer to as the politically correct view of how we're supposed to view, in this case, Islam, which is the subject that he was talking about. And my question is, if we're going to shut down everyone who disagrees with the orthodoxy, which in this case is the politically correct view, if we shut all of those people down, are we not denying ourselves the opportunity to improve our understanding, to increase our understanding, to change and learn over time? If we restrict ourselves to what we already know, to what we already believe, and all other opinions are shut down, what we are saying is that at this point, put a stake in the ground, because this is the point where our ideological progress stopped. Dissenting views are no longer allowed. Nothing's going to change from here.
So, in other words, freedom of speech really should mean freedom to offend someone, to be offensive almost.
That's what it translates into. Now, I personally am not someone who goes out of my way to offend people, but the reality is being offended is not a crime. The person who offended you has not committed a crime by offending you. And what we have is a situation where people's sensitivity, people's proclivity towards being offended is actually dictating the freedom with which the rest of us are allowed to think and to speak. It's absolutely absurd.
My guest is Topher Field. Topher, so if I said, in my experience, everyone with the name Topher is a goose and shouldn't be allowed to make films, your point is, well, that's silly and offensive, but you wouldn't want to shut down the person who says that.
Absolutely not. And those who do want to shut down the people who said that are actually, in essence, criticising the intelligence of the listeners. So, for example, we had a flag maker. I think he might have even been a Queensland flag maker. I didn't come prepared to talk about this particular topic, so I haven't done my background on it. But I believe it was a Queensland flag maker who came out and said some ridiculous pro-Nazi things a little while ago. It was in the news. If you remember the incident, then help me out with some of the details.
Vaguely, but
now, the public response to the ridiculous things that he said tells you everything that you need to know about why free speech works. When someone comes out and says something that is offensive, we don't need a government body stepping in and finding them or telling them that it's offensive or what have you. The public response of your thinking, breathing, living human beings who have a mind of their own and can make up their own mind for themselves will provide the response. That's the way that we need to handle the issue of free speech. People who come out and say ridiculous things will be penalised in the marketplace of ideas. They'll be penalised by the general public simply in other people's responses to what they've said.
Now, your video, The History of Unpopular People, is funded by the Conservative Leadership Foundation. Did they place one of the funders, did they place any provisos or any, editorial direction on you and how you made your film?
None whatsoever. The way that I work, and I have in the past been offered some fairly significant sums of money for with the proviso that I say these certain things or make a documentary on this certain topic. And so far I've turned every single one of those offers down. The way that I work is I look at the world and I decide what it is that I believe I want to say and what I believe needs to be said. And I will then put out a brief and basically say, look, this is what I want to do. I will give as much detail as I feel I reasonably can at that point in time. And then people can make up their own minds whether or not they want to support that vision and whether or not they want to support that project. If someone comes along and says, hey, I'm going to give you a large sum of money if you change this, my first question, the first thing that I'm going to do is look at what they want me to change and say, do I actually believe that or not? If the change is something that I do already believe in and agree with, and it is a part of something that I would like to say, then I'm open to the idea. If in any way they're trying to change my views or essentially make me a voice for hire rather than someone who's putting out my view of the world for other people to listen to or not listen to as they see fit, if they're actually trying to change what it is that I'm saying, then I'm not interested. I am not a voice for hire. I'm here to try and make a difference.
How do people see your films, your short films, Topher Field?
Well, that's as varied as there are human beings on the planet, of course. Take, for example, what so far has been my most controversial work, which was the work to do with Qantas, where before the Qantas shutdown, I was essentially warning the unions, saying, look, you're actually potentially bargaining your own selves out of a job here. I don't want to see jobs go overseas, but if we don't do something pretty drastic pretty soon, then that's going to be the outcome. That video went around a number of the Qantas union members, and I got a very, very strongly worded and sometimes very rudely worded response to that one online. If you read the comments under that video, you'll see what I mean.
So the best way is to type into a search engine the forbidden history of unpopular people and start.
Well, that's
from there.
for the latest one, yeah.
The latest one.
You'll
give us your website address, because I've got 40 seconds before I'm going to lose a satellite link.
The Forbidden History of Unpopular People can be found at theforbiddenhistory.com. That's my latest and so far most popular work, theforbiddenhistory.com. If you follow the links from there, you can find the rest of my work.
Appreciate that, Topher Field. Speak to you again, I hope, one day.
Thank you for your time, Steve.